Welcome, everyone. This is Neil with Portal to Ascension. Thank you all so much for being with us here today. Happy New Year, everybody. We're on the second day of 2018, and I'm extremely excited for what's to come and what we're going to experience this year. And we're starting the year off right with an amazing presenter and an amazing journalist and individual that worked for the the Ministry of Defense in Britain. So we're starting the year off with Nick Pope today in order to basically talk about the recent disclosures that occurred on December 16th and that have been trickling ever since then. And Nick actually worked for the Ministry of Defense in the UK, and he was basically doing the same thing that this Luis individual has been doing for the US government in regards to identifying unidentified aerial threats. So I wanted to bring him on because he's actually been quoted quite a lot in some of the news articles since he's been doing this for a while and bringing out information. So they've been using Nick Pope to comment on the recent occurrence and what his opinion is. So we're going to go ahead and bring him on right now. Nick, are you with us?
Great to be on and to share this exciting information ahead of the online conference later this month.
Right.
These revelations, starting, as you say, on December 16th in the New York Times, have been absolutely extraordinary and I think almost without precedent in terms of serious mainstream national and indeed international news media coverage of this subject. For far too long, this is a topic which has often been either ignored or ridiculed by the mainstream media. And yet here it is in the Times, the Post, on the BBC, and indeed pretty much every high-profile media outlet on the face of the planet. I think perhaps I should just start off by giving a very brief overview of what has happened for anyone who's missed this. You know, both of you. You really, I think it would be difficult to miss this one. And as you say, it's been blanket media coverage pretty much since December 16th when this broke. But perhaps, nonetheless, it would be helpful, as I say, to give a brief overview. Effectively, after many years of denial that there was any official US government interest in the subject of UFOs and any investigation, I mean, essentially they said that the old United States Air Force program, Project Blue Book, closed in 1969, and the official position of the US government was that since then there's been no interest or involvement in this subject. The New York Times essentially produced verifiable information to show that that claim was not correct, that from 2007 to 2012, the Pentagon had a UFO project, and that it was cunningly, I guess, hidden in plain sight by giving it a kind of unusual name, Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program. Very similar, in fact, to something that we did in the United Kingdom, where we completely dropped the term UFO and replaced it with UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. So what happened was the DOD, the Pentagon, had this project looking at UFOs, and several of the people involved in this have been quoted in the media. The main one, Luis Elizondo, but also as part of the story, intriguing F-18 Super Hornet footage, film footage of Navy jets chasing UFOs has been released, and the pilots have gone on the public record too. I mean, in terms of verifiable claims, it really doesn't get much better than this. There was a government program, the military chased these things, and here's the footage, and here the story is in the New York Times. I think if you'd have said to anyone in the UFO or the alternative belief community in November of last year, what's your desired end state with regards to treatment of the topic? Something like that would have been pretty high on the list. I mean, you really couldn't make it up, and yet it's all come true, and an awful lot of people who were being doubted and derided by their friends for being interested in this subject, well, now they simply point to the New York Times coverage, and they say, well, look, you see, I was right all along. The government was doing this, the military was chasing them, and they've even got these things, whatever they might be, on camera. Now, I should say that I had not been involved formally in this Pentagon program. As you would expect, I'm a UK citizen, despite living now in the US. I had actually left the UK Ministry of Defence by the time this project was set up. But in many ways, it's something familiar to me because the job that I did back in the UK in the 90s was almost identical. The remit was the same: research and investigate the UFO sightings, particularly when it's your own people, military personnel, seeing these things, and effectively handle this subject for the government. And that's why, as you said in your introductory piece, although I was not involved in this project, or indeed in breaking the story in the New York Times, I had been called on by the BBC and by Channel 4 News and by The Guardian and by effectively most of the British media covering this story to add my own perspective on this and to give a sort of insider's insight into the what's, when's, why's and who's of this program. And that's what I'm now sharing with you and the people watching and listening to this. I mean, I think it's an extremely important story. There are a couple of other brief points I'll make on this. Firstly, Robert Bigelow is involved, and he's a name, of course, eminently familiar with the UFO community, and everyone will have heard of his involvement, the space entrepreneur, the billionaire who's taken a close personal interest in this subject. Harry Reid, when he was the Senate Majority Leader, he was instrumental in setting up the Pentagon's AATIP program. Interestingly, a lot of that program was then moved to Bigelow Aerospace, and a lot of people are saying, well, why was that? Well, of course, one of the big reasons is that moving programs like this into the private sector has the twin advantages for government of, firstly, moving it outside of the scope of the Freedom of Information Act, and secondly, making congressional oversight and scrutiny more difficult. So that's one of the take-homes of this. And I think it's interesting. I know that a lot of journalists and UFO researchers have made Freedom of Information Act requests pretty much the moment this story broke. I'm afraid they're in for a bit of a disappointment. A lot of this material, because it was handled in the private sector, will be exempt. Perhaps the other intriguing point about all this is the reference, almost a throwaway reference in the original Times story, to the fact that there are materials from some of these sightings that Bigelow Aerospace had and has been studying. I mean, literally, people are saying metal, alloys, debris, whatever it is, wreckage, it's slightly unclear, but materials, recovered materials from UAP, UFOs, whatever you want to call them, that have been analyzed. And again, for all the people who say, you know, debunk all this and laugh at it and say, oh, Roswell didn't happen, and of course the government doesn't have anything like this. Well, according to the New York Times, maybe they do. So it has been a watershed moment, I think, for the UFO community. 2018 is starting with this stratospherically impactful story. I don't know whether this is going to be, you know, as many people say, the year of disclosure, but it really could not have started this year in a more interesting way. And buckle up, we have one heck of a ride ahead.
Right. In this story, there seems to be a lot of consistencies, Nick, that I wanted you to touch on. They've been saying that the DoD just said to the mainstream media that they weren't aware that this footage would be used for public release. And then some other CIA officials have been saying that this footage is possibly fake. And it's kind of interesting because no matter what, the cat is out of the bag, and they've said, basically they've said without saying it, that extraterrestrial phenomena is real. However, now it's coming out that maybe they're putting it out in a way that isn't authentic. What's your take on that?
Well, the picture is somewhat murky, and one of the other players, of course, who deserves a name check in getting this story out, whatever you think of him and his involvement, is, of course, Tom DeLonge, the musician. He was largely responsible for putting a team together of people like Luis Elizondo, genuine insiders in this community. My understanding is that the footage is real. It is indeed official DoD footage that was indeed taken, two separate bits of footage, by the way, one from 2004, the Nimitz footage, one undated piece of footage, the precise details of which, in terms of location, date, etc., is not known. My understanding is that, as I say, A, this film footage is real. B, yes, technically it was not released to the New York Times by the DoD, but it was acquired, I understand, by Tom DeLonge's To the Stars Academy through the offices of Luis Elizondo. Now, one of the questions which is being asked is whether this material, even though it was probably properly reviewed, declassified, and released, but whether it seems to have been one of Luis Elizondo's last acts before leaving government service. And perhaps there are some questions in terms of propriety to be asked about the circumstances under which he was responsible for declassifying and releasing material, which he would then go on to talk about in his capacity as a member of Tom DeLonge's advisory board. But of course, those are not questions for me. I mean, those are questions that Luis Elizondo will have to answer, and it may be that the Pentagon is conducting some sort of investigation into his conduct in all this. I'd be surprised if they weren't. I suspect he's smart enough to know where the line is and not to cross it. He doesn't seem to be a whistleblower in conventional terms. I think, as I say, though, one of his last acts in government service does seem to have been himself collaborating, I suppose, with Tom DeLonge and his team, perhaps with the Times too, in getting this material out into the public domain. So yes, there are some questions, but not, I think, over the fundamental authenticity of what we're seeing. And bear in mind, I mean, I now work as a journalist myself. I have written previously for the BBC. I've written for the New York Times, and I can tell you their fact-checking process is meticulous, I would say bordering on brutal, as it should be. They will not have run this story without having checked and cross-checked and triple-checked their sources. And indeed, one of the three reporters involved with this, Ralph Blumenthal, wrote a follow-up piece, I think on about December 18th or 19th, talking about how this story first got to the attention of the Times, talking about some of the processes that they did to check out the story, because as he said, you know, kind of with a wry smile, I think, yeah, this is not the sort of story that the Times usually run. So we bent over backwards to make sure we were, you know, right down the line on this, and that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed.
Right. Tom actually said in October on his Twitter feed, he said that every word that is going to come out basically from then until now has been planned for months. And so that leads me to believe that, you know, the release date was planned, how it went viral with everyone. He even said at a Joe Rogan interview a few months ago that he has the mainstream outlets basically waiting. They're like little dogs basically waiting around for him to be like, okay, go ahead and release the story. And it all went really like perfectly exactly how he had said he was going to go a few months ago. So my question is, do you think that what they're doing is going against the will of the Defense Department, or maybe do you think that's just for show because the Defense Department's saying that Luis went behind their back and released this footage?
Well, I think there's no getting away from the fact that the Pentagon were, I think, A, incensed by this story, and B, very much caught on the back foot by it. Again, if you look at Ralph Blumenthal's article about this, you'll see that Leslie Kean, who of course is another important player in all of this, who was loosely involved with Tom DeLonge's group, not as an advisory board member, but as a journalist who has taken a close personal interest in this subject. Leslie Kean was aware of Tom DeLonge's work and of Luis Elizondo's involvement. Leslie, I believe, then took the story to Ralph Blumenthal at the Times. Ralph, I think, then talked to some other Times editors. They met with Luis Elizondo, they checked him out, they did background checks, face-to-face interviews. He is who he says he is, he did what he said he did, and then, of course, good journalism. You have to kind of keep this under wraps to make sure no other news outlet scoops you. But they, fairly late in the day, of course, approached the Pentagon for an official comment on all this, and somewhat reluctantly, the Pentagon said effectively, yeah, you got us, we did have such a program. Now, of course, they sought desperately to downplay this, to kind of spin it, and I've done the same for the British government, of course, when this was my job, but to spin it as something that they did in the margins of maybe looking at other things like foreign military drones and such like. But there's no getting away from the fact that even though they didn't use the terminology, this was a UFO project. Everyone working on it knew exactly what it was. They were looking at unknowns, and not really from the public, almost exclusively from their own military personnel. I mean, the AATIP project was really focused on sightings of unknowns, whatever you want to call them, by pilots, including sightings where things were simultaneously being tracked on radar. So, as I say, the Pentagon were, I think, caught by surprise. I mean, I've heard reports literally of the defense secretary being pulled out of a meeting, in the couple of weeks before Christmas and told, sir, they've got hold of this, what do we do? Because, of course, as I said right at the beginning, the difficulty, the embarrassment with all this is that consistently, persistently, for many years, in absolutely unequivocal terms, the US government has said, we do not investigate UFOs. And it turned out they did.
Right. Now, when you were working for the UK government, did you ever share notes with the US government or coincide or speak to any officials there in regards to their program?
We had very limited liaison with other countries. The British government's UFO project was narrowly focused. The terms of reference specifically mentioned sightings within the UK's air defence region, occasionally reaching out through defence attaches, air attaches, through the embassies. Occasionally we reached out to other countries. Pretty much the United States, even to those of us in the Ministry of Defence, gave almost the same line that has been given to the media and the public. Yeah, we're not in this game anymore. Now, of course, I was asking that question back in the 90s, and that was before AATIP was set up. So, perhaps it was true, but AATIP won't have been operating in a vacuum. Before AATIP and after Project Blue Book, there will have been something doing the same thing. Self-evidently, any government, any air force that experiences these sightings in its own airspace, we don't ignore them. Somebody will have been looking at them.
So they said that they were spending $22 million a year. And do you think that this number is kind of just put out there just because it doesn't seem like that big in the grand scheme of the military defense? And do you think that maybe they spent more? And do you have any idea how much the UK government spent on their programs?
Well, I've heard two different versions of this story. I have heard $22 million a year for the AATIP program. I also heard somebody say that it was $22 million actually in total over the whole life of the project, which seems to have been 2007 to 2012. Be that as it may, whichever of those versions is true, and I speak here as somebody who's done a financial policy job within government myself in the UK, there are different ways of doing the figures. Yes, in one sense, it's not big bucks. I mean, just to put $22 million into perspective, it will buy you about a quarter of a new F-35 stealth fighter. So if you look at it in terms of the overall Pentagon budget, no, it's very small potatoes. However, there are ways of doing the accounting. And if you don't use what I would call resource accounting, then there are ways that arguably the budget will have been much bigger, but they'll effectively be downplaying it. And what I mean by that is this. Most of the things that you use on a UFO project already exist. So, for example, your radar systems, your sophisticated, fully integrated radar systems, your communications systems, your space tracking radar, your satellites, the ballistic missile early warning system, your imagery analysts, all of that, all that equipment, all that personnel already exist. So if you use a non-resource accounting method of doing the math and don't count things that you already possess, then actually you can quote 22 million and those are probably the additional cash costs only of the project. And frankly, those additional cash costs seem to have gone to Bigelow Aerospace in this movement of much of the work from government into the private sector. So I guess my take-home message from all that is that if you accounted for this in a way that took into consideration the resources used, it would sound like a much bigger project. But self-evidently, in one respect, what the Pentagon is trying to do here is a little bit of damage limitation. They're trying, as we did in the UK, to downplay the scope of this project and say, oh, it was just a tiny thing. It was a drop in the bucket.
When you were working for the UK government, were there a lot of people, and I'm sure there probably was, a lot of people who were not in the know? Because right now, obviously, this is coming out, and if I know about it, every congressman, every senator should know about this, and I'm pretty sure most of them probably didn't know what was happening. So I feel this may cause chaos, especially because a lot of people in high-level positions probably think that they know all they need to know. So just having this come out of nowhere and then realizing like there's a whole UFO program that was going on and these people didn't know about it could cause some ruckus in Washington, D.C. What's your take on that?
I understand that it's causing huge ruckus and problems behind the scene, not least because, as I mentioned earlier, of course, everyone from presidents downwards, and we've all seen various presidents go on Jimmy Kimmel and make jokes about this subject, but then say, you know, we don't really do this sort of thing, you know, it's all X-Files kind of stuff. And they have played it for laughs. So, you know, from the president down, I understand people were running around and saying, hey, wait a minute, we've been telling people we don't do this. What do you mean we do? So there is some considerable embarrassment in official circles at the moment. An awful lot of people running around asking, you know, who knew about this and why wasn't I told about this, and just exactly why did we have this program and why the heck did you put all the press officers and everyone who was asked about this, why the heck did you brief them to say, no, we don't do this, we're not interested?
Right. I saw a tweet from Rand Paul saying to Harry Reid saying, we fought about taxes, we fought about healthcare, and we fought about something else. But how come you never told me about the UFOs? You know, so like they're really tripping out right now, I feel.
Yes, they are, and of course there's one thing to be said about sending an amusing tweet, but don't let that hide the fact that there are some hard and serious questions being asked about this right now in the US administration. And yes, this story broke at a kind of awkward time. Everyone was just about getting ready for the Christmas holiday. But now, in the new year, in the cold light of day, there are an awful lot of people in the DOD, and you know, the Congress, wherever, saying, okay, let's take a moment here. We've gotten over our shock about this story. We've gotten over the kind of giggle factor about it, and we've done the kind of X-Files news headlines. Now let's find out how much taxpayers' money was spent on this, where that money went, and just what exactly has the government concluded about this phenomenon. Because you don't do a 5-year program and not conclude something. You don't have materials in a warehouse somewhere, whatever the nature of these things, and not study them with isotopic ratio tests, mass spectrometers, the whole array of equipment. An awful lot of people somewhere, despite this being deeply compartmentalized and very cleverly hidden, an awful lot of people will have been working on this, and some very smart people, government people, scientists, and you know, what did they conclude that we were dealing with this? You know, what do the imagery analysts say about this film footage? What do the metallurgists and the chemists say about these recovered materials? There are various senators, Congress people, staffers, politicians, you know, a lot of people in government asking, okay, we did this. Where does the trail lead? What do we know?
Right. So in the countless mainstream news articles, they spend a lot of time talking about the UFOs and not really talking about who's behind them. So I feel that maybe this is just the beginning stage of the disclosure, because obviously, if we're talking about UFOs that aren't from this planet, and Luis said that these are nothing foreign and nothing domestic that we know of, and then he said we're probably not alone. So you said earlier that this may not be the year of disclosure, but what's your take on? Do you think this is the shift that we needed in order to eventually get the disclosure on a mass level?
As ever, these questions about disclosure depend on what there is to disclose. If there is, as many people believe, a spaceship hidden away in a hangar somewhere, then fair enough, that's a fair question. If there are just some bits of metal, but we can't quite figure out what they came from, and if jets have chased these things, but we've never actually caught up with them, and haven't recovered one of these craft, then it comes back to a quote that I gave to the BBC. And I said words to the effect of, you know, this in some way parallels the work that I did in the UK government, but about as far as we can go with this is saying, and this was my quote, I think, there's something out there, but we don't really know what it is. Now, Luis Elizondo has gone somewhat further than that, and he's said, I think, you know, it doesn't seem to be military and not Russian drone or spy plane. What else could it be? We're probably not alone. It's probably extraterrestrial. Tom DeLonge clearly believes that. Tom DeLonge has hinted that there is more to come, that he has other material, that he has more footage that's going to be released, more revelations. Perhaps other people who were involved in this program are going to come forward. Bear in mind, one of the things that happened in relation to Roswell was that a while ago, I think one of the secretaries of the Air Force issued a kind of amnesty and said, if anyone has something on this, but believes they're still bound by their secrecy oath, I hereby release them from it. Well, we might have pressure now for almost a blanket presidential statement to that effect. And if we got something like that from President Trump, and if he said, okay, anyone who is involved in any aspect of this, no matter what you think is still classified, I, as Commander-in-Chief, am now telling you it's not. You can come forward, you can release everything you've been sitting on, all those secrets that you've carried for all those years, the people now, I think, have a right to know, and this is me, your commander-in-chief, giving you an order, then we'll be in a different ballgame. So it kind of depends. It depends where we go from here. The next few weeks and months are going to be critical. The only thing I think that we can be certain about is that this story has by no means ended. Indeed, in a very real sense, it's only just begun. We have some fascinating times ahead, some hard decisions to make, in government, I mean by that. And as I say, buckle up. It's going to be one heck of a ride this year.
So Joe Rogan, on the Joe Rogan podcast, Tom DeLonge said that the Russians had an actual extraterrestrial body, and he said that he hasn't seen. He also spoke about anti-gravity technology and other types of technology that the people that he works with. He said look at the people I'm hanging out with. Speaking about like DOD, CIA people, and he said that that they have all this type of technology. He was mentioning it, and then Joe Rogan said, "Well, have you seen any of this?" And he goes, "Oh no, I haven't seen it. They've just told me." But then he said, over the next few months, he's going to be releasing some of this technology. But it's very interesting to me that he's taking this 100% on what they're telling him. He hasn't seen any of these crafts and this technology, but he said he's going to release it. So you're right. What you said about disclosure is right. Like, there's two levels. What is there to disclose? Oh, the fact is the documents have been disclosed. So technically disclosure has happened. But then the disclosure that I guess we're looking for is a mass top-down kind of authority figure telling us, hey, extraterrestrials exist and this phenomenon is real.
Yes, and let's not forget that there are differing agendas here. People like Tom DeLonge, I think, are what I would characterize as activists. Other people have different agendas. Government has probably the exact opposite agenda. I think a lot of people in government, the default position is let's sit on this. Sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of legitimate concerns that other people might get their hands on the technology first, and that those people might not be favorably disposed towards the United States, whether they're other nations or non-state actors. Now, and then you've got the third player in all this, arguably the most interesting of all, the private sector. We talked about how much of the AATIP program was moved into Bigelow Aerospace. Well, all the people like Robert Bigelow, Elon Musk, all the people involved in the big Silicon Valley tech companies, the people looking at artificial intelligence, for example, all those people are going to be interested in this kind of thing, because my goodness, even if you're skeptical, if any of these claims turn out to be true, if just one fragment of these so-called recovered materials turns out to be extraterrestrial, this is a game changer in terms of our understanding of science and technology. The first person to be able to piece that together and exploit it for fair means or for foul, is going to be in the driving seat. So I think there are conflicting agendas here. I know Tom DeLonge is involved in this I guess, initiative to raise funds to exploit this from a technological point of view. I think you'll need billions, not millions, to do this, which is why, as I say, it's probably the people like Elon Musk and Sergey Brin and Zuckerberg and all those sorts of people and Bigelow, of course, who'll end up driving this. We see already with the space program that it's kind of shifted in the last few years. NASA are still big players, of course, but the future, there's no getting away from the fact that the future of the space program is in the private sector. And I suspect that the UFO issue too has already effectively moved into the private domain, and it's going to be the big corporations, the tech billionaires, that will make the ultimate decisions on this. Maybe no longer maybe the president, the defense secretary or whoever.
Do you feel that there could be different departments or factions within the government that work with UFOs, that this could be just one faction? Because obviously within the community, and you go to a lot of these events too, the topic of the secret space program is really big, but they're not touching on it or really speaking about
behind
anything secret.
Doors on this question. There's a war going on, and there are different factions. Well, I think sometimes he kind of shoots from the hip a little bit with his statements, and you know, we should bear in mind he's a musician, not a politician, and you know, I wouldn't expect him to speak in the sorts of language that a politician would. But those statements that he made likely do reflect precisely the kind of, I guess, conflicting situation that I believe is the case behind closed doors at the moment. That there are different players involved in this, different factions, different agendas, and it's not all, oh yes, the way ahead on this is clear. There is one path and one path only. There genuinely is a debate about how to handle this, how best to take it forward, and Tom DeLonge clearly has his ideas, Robert Bigelow has his ideas, and all sorts of other people probably have their ideas too.
What's your take on, since you work for the Ministry of Defense, which is the Defense Department, and over here it's all military backing, all the people on his board are military officials and privatized military. There's this talk on militarization of space, and that's what they want to do, is order to militarize space to protect us from a fake alien threat. And there's this talk on a false flag agenda. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that gets to the heart of the point about different agendas and different players. The default mindset in the military, I mean, this is the thing, when you embed a UFO program in government, you inevitably end up putting it with the Air Force, with the DoD, and you get that kind of militaristic mindset. The moment you move it into the private sector, you get a different mindset. That's why the French government almost has a unique way of handling this. Their UFO program is not in their DoD at all, it's in their space agency, and that gives you a very different perspective, even with a government-run program. But I think what your question gets to the heart of is this kind of dogfight going on, that there are those with, I suppose, a military background and a militaristic view of what we should do with this subject and this technology. And then there are those who take, I suppose they would use words like a more enlightened, egalitarian, new age, whatever phrase you use, but a more open approach in this. Let's just get that technology out there, that people have a right to know. If there's materials hidden away in a warehouse somewhere, and even if you don't know what it is, let's get it out there so we can all see it. Hey, if this is taxpayers' money, we paid for it. It's a fair point. And, you know, those sorts of debates will be exactly the debates playing themselves out, you know, as we speak. I mean, people will be asking those sorts of questions now.
It seems like they opened up a can of worms when they said something about the metal alloy that they have that's non-terrestrial. So at this point, I feel maybe the next step would be to have a third-party person talk about what that is or release the findings. Yes.
Now, I've seen some slightly misleading reports on this. That, you know, let's not mangle the science here. There's no such thing as unknown materials. I mean, everything is made up of elements that sit somewhere on the periodic table. However, there are different isotopes of those elements, and some of those occur naturally and terrestrially, and others don't. And here's a good analogy. A lot of people sell and buy meteorites, and you might think, well, how do I know that I'm getting a genuine meteorite, not just a rock that someone picked up in their backyard and put on eBay? Well, the answer is that when you expose something like that to cosmic rays that you find in space, but that the Earth's atmosphere protects us from largely, then those cosmic rays can cause chemical changes in in the elements in the rock that can enable you to differentiate. So, and the other thing is that there is ionization. Now, I won't get too technical, and apologies if I have already, but the simple fact is this: if anyone wants to do a little bit of research on this, look at the kind of tests that they do on meteorites, and you can tell if something has been in space. So even if this recovered material isn't like a spaceship, if it's just fragments of metal, you'll be able to tell if it's come from space. Now, again, arguably, that doesn't prove it's extraterrestrial civilization that's developed that. I mean, we send things into space, but not many things. You know, if it didn't come off a missile or a rocket or a satellite, there's not much else to go. So the fundamental question is, have any of these materials, because of these sorts of tests that I discussed, that you can do with mass spectrometers, looking at the isotopic ratios, have any of these tests concluded that these materials have been in space? It's a yes-no question. And make no mistake about it. These tests are not, you know, me saying this here is not going to cause government scientists to go, oh gosh, that's a good idea. I mean, it is so obvious that anyone involved in research into this will have done it in an instant. So these tests have already been done. That's my point. That's why earlier I said there will be results. Analyses will have been done. Reports will have been written. And there will be results to all this somewhere. Now, they might be outside the scope of Freedom of Information Act, but that's why if this was paid for with taxpayers' money, then some of the people in Congress may want to go after this material aggressively and say, okay, let's have these materials. Let's, as you said, let's get a third-party analysis, and let's see the results of any tests that have already been done. Those reports exist. They'll be sitting somewhere.
As a representative that you were working for the Ministry of Defense in the UK, were there any documents and activities that took place that you were not allowed to speak on? Yes. I'm bound by the Official Secrets Act, and even though I've retired from the Ministry of Defense, that binds me for life. The MOD is in the process of declassifying and releasing its own UFO files, and I can talk about the ones that have been released, but where the Ministry of Defense has redacted some of that information, as it has done, then of course that information is regarded still as classified. And although I'm somebody who goes on to the BBC and elsewhere and talks about these issues as, I guess, somebody giving an insider's perspective into this, I'm not a whistleblower. I'm not going to break the law on this. And if the Ministry of Defense in the UK decides that it wants to keep something secret, then I'm going to have to abide by that. Do you ever get contacted by them if they tell you that you're going too far or anything like that?
No, I know where the line is and I don't cross it. I do occasionally check back with them. I still have friends and colleagues at the Ministry of Defense, of course. I mean, I worked there for 21 years, 3 years on their UFO project, 5 years on security policy. So I know my way around this, and I do check back from time to time if there's a particular issue on which I'm not certain. But no, I have not been warned off for crossing the line. As I say, you don't work there on these sorts of questions and not know very clearly where the line is.
Right. And so it's important to note that you said that Luis isn't a whistleblower, and I think a lot of people are thinking of him as one because he's coming out and saying this, but he's going within the confines of the law and what he's allowed to say. Anyone can say. He's just the one that has those documents that are already declassified. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think I obviously have not met Luis Elizondo. I've not discussed this with him. I am aware from other parties of some other issues, and you know, let's just say that there are some people within the administration who are not particularly pleased with him right now. Doubtless there will be an investigation going on, whether it's an official investigation or a kind of unofficial, let's take a quick look at this guy and make sure that he hasn't divulged anything classified. But he clearly has extensive experience of working within classified programs in government. He's a smart guy. He knows very clearly that if he divulges information which the US government regards still as classified, make no mistake about it, he will be arrested.
Okay, so let's wrap it up here. I want to ask one last question. So in the countless years that, well, in the years that you've been actually doing all this research and the time that you worked for the Ministry of Defense, was there any information on actual interactions with extraterrestrials with world governments?
I do not recall having seen any documents relating to face-to-face contact or other interactions between government and any extraterrestrial faction, entity, or such like. I can't guarantee that something like that didn't happen and I just didn't get to hear about it. I mean, I had a top secret SCI security clearance, but you know, who knows? There are probably plenty of people right now in the Pentagon with very, very high security clearances and need to know, who are still slightly surprised about AATIP and saying, hey, why didn't I know about this? So I'll never say never, but I didn't see it myself and I didn't get to hear about it.
Beautiful. Awesome, Nick. Thank you so much, brother, for everything and your tireless work and effort to bring out the truth to the public. So really appreciate you. And thank you for being here. And why don't we just go right into you speaking about the Extraterrestrial Disclosure Summit and telling us a little bit about what you're going to be presenting on January 20th.
Well, on January 20th, in the online summit, I will be speaking a little bit about the program to declassify and release the Ministry of Defense files. But of course, with these recent revelations about Pentagon's UFO program, I think everybody would be expecting me to say some more about this, particularly building on these comments today, building on the fact that this is a fast-moving, rapidly evolving situation where doubtless in the next couple of weeks there will be new developments. I will, of course, be updating people about the Pentagon AATIP revelations and discussing that too. So I'm going to be talking about the UK program, but very much linking it to the bigger picture and contextualizing it in terms of the Pentagon program.
All right, amazing. Okay, so do you want to share any last words with us in regards to what's going on now, what we can expect?
No, I think my final comment would simply be to watch this story carefully, to be careful with it. An awful lot has been written which is not necessarily particularly well informed. So choose your sources carefully. And when talking about, for example, questions about how this story got out, go back to those original sources. So look at what Leslie Kean has said about this. Look at what Ralph Blumenthal from the New York Times has said about this. Look at what Luis Elizondo himself has told various mainstream media outlets. Look at what the Navy F-18 pilots have said about this. You know, none of that is to say that people shouldn't listen to all the usual people in the UFO community, but go back to those original sources first and then extrapolate from there. So this is an interesting story, but it's a complex one. There are lots of different facets to it. The program itself, the moving of the program into the private sector, the footage, the materials. It's a big story and it's a complex one. And as I say, it's a story as well with a lot of different players involved, not all of whom necessarily have the same agenda here. So interesting times.
Right, it's big and complex, and it looks like it's going to get even more complex as time progresses.
Yes, indeed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. Really appreciate you, brother, for all you are and all you do. And I'm really excited to catch up with you in a few weeks.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to the online conference and speaking about this in more detail and with some updated new information.
Beautiful. All right, Nick, take care, brother. Have a beautiful day.
You too. Thank you.
Speak later. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today with Nick Pope. And we're actually going to go live in a few hours with David Sarita, and we're going to have more Facebook Live broadcasts over the next month or two. Leading up to this month, we're going to have broadcasts probably every couple of days leading up to the Extraterrestrial Disclosure Online Summit. And we created this online summit a year ago. The date was solidified, so we had no idea that all of this was going to transpire weeks before our actual summit on the disclosure of the extraterrestrial presence. And now that all this is happening, and even more is planned to come out this month, as per Tom DeLonge and other officials, we're going to kind of take a look at what's exactly has happened on the 20th, but not only go into the information on what's been going on with this disclosure, where Nick Pope's going to be touching on that, but also speaking about his own work in the Ministry of Defense in the UK. We'll also have Grant Cameron, who we've had on multiple times. And you can go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/portal to Ascension. And the last 6 videos have been UFO disclosure videos that we've done with other different presenters: Steve Bassett, Grant Cameron, Ray Hernandez from Free, Paula Harris, and now Nick Pope, David Sarita today. You can kind of take a look at the information we've compiled and the research we've compiled about the history of what's going on. So we'll be taking a look at it then. But as well as that, we'll be talking about more of a broader aspect of extraterrestrial presence. We'll be going into the spiritual nature of extraterrestrials. We'll be going into ancient civilizations. We're going to have an individual called Michael Schratt, and he does not do presentations. He's not on the UFO circuit. Only now he's entering the UFO circuit. This individual, he was in Unacknowledged, the documentary by Stephen Greer, and he worked for black ops programs, basically reverse engineering technology for the U.S. government. And a lot of those crafts that we see, the triangle crafts, a lot of reverse engineered crafts that may not actually be terrestrial, but advanced craft from our own military, he was actually one of the engineers that were designing them. And so he's coming out to do his first presentation with us on the Extraterrestrial Disclosure Online Summit. So it's going to be an extremely interesting weekend. It's a 2-day event, January 20th and January 21st. So less than 3 weeks from now. And that's going to lead up to us doing nonstop events on spreading this awareness throughout the entire year. We have the Disclosure Tour planned up, where we're going to be traveling the world with speakers on this information and on the information that existed before any of this occurred on December 16th, spreading this disclosure awareness to local cities. We also have the Lost Civilizations Tour. The Lost Civilizations Tour is simply that, just to go around exposing the truth of our world history and relaying new findings, scientific facts, and archaeological evidence that what we've been told and what we've been taught in the history books are actually quite far from the truth. So there's a lot in store this year. I'm extremely excited, really blessed to be with you here 2 days after the New Year's. Let's make this year big, guys. Like, this is happening. The cat's out of the bag. UFOs exist. Now you have something that you can back up and say, well, this is validated as true. You can show your family and friends. But the truth is that the next step is the grassroots movement. We can watch what's happening. We can see what's going on. But it's really, a disclosure is going to come from within. It's going to come from the individual. It's going to come when we all have a shift in consciousness. So we appreciate you very much. Let's make this a great year. And stay tuned. We'll be back online probably within a few hours with David Sarita. All right, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.